Psychologists of Reddit, how has your own personal perception of everyday people changed throughout your career? I'd say the following quotes sum up the perceptions I have developed so far. If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Ian McLaren. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Hanlon's Razor. These are some good butt quotes. I wish L could gild you, but I've only got 23 cents in my bank account. This is hard, since by the time we're licensed psychologists, we've been learning and practicing the trade for often up to more than a decade. It's an insidious onset, this psychologist perspective. I know it can make it hard for me to not go into automatic assessment intervention mode with people I meet who aren't patients. So many people have easily identifiable and treatable problems that they just casually talk about. As a friend, I make suggestions but have to hold back actual treatment or conceptualizations. Nobody wants to be the friend that fulfills the stereotype of therapist all the dang time. I think I've gotten much better at differentiating between process and content when I interact with others. It's almost like I can step outside of the interaction, observe it with less reactivity or judgment, and then respond. It sounds so basic, but considering the why or the how of someone's thoughts, words, behavior can be much more informative than you'd think. And you completely miss that information if you only focus on what they say. As an example, during a recent argument with he said something really insulting about me. It was helpful to step back from avoid ruminating about reacting to the specific thing that he said and think about why it was important for him to say that during that specific interaction. What events preceded those statements? I really admire the skill that you have developed. I don't like confrontation, and when I have an argument with someone, I usually end up reacting emotionally. Parents are the worst. I was a youth counselor aide at a school. Wasn't allowed to really help kids without parental consent. At most I could talk to them and then write recommendations for the overburdened psychologist who is dealing with 5 schools worth of teenagers whose parents just don't listen to them. Your kids are disrespecting you. Please just talk to them. Tangentially, I am now studying to become a speech pathologist, and I heard the parents are just as bad for this profession, too. I don't know if this is a recent uptick or if it's always been like this, but professionals telling you that your child is suffering, whether psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally, or physiologically, does not mean we are slighting your parenting. If parents would just give us an inch, we could help their children reach potentials they can't even see. But parents would rather ban their kids from talking to me or my psychologist boss. We had lots of frustrated talks about that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I see a lot more people not listening and a lot of people sticking their heads in the sand. Yeah, the internet seems pretty brushed up on mental illness, but everyday people are not. I get so frustrated when people just do not listen. It changes my entire view of them. Parents are the worst. All that needs to be said. Any progress you make with the kid is immediately undone by the next visit. I'm only a master's level counselor, but I've been doing this for about 3 years now. In summary, literally nothing anyone tells me surprises me now. Someone asked me one day, "So have you gotten anything weird yet?" Like someone who thinks they're God, and I realized in that moment, even that was no longer weird to me. You sold your grandma into prostitution for coke money? Cool story, bro. You believe you're in your own version of The Truman Show. What's that like? I've learned that people carry around just so many layers of just crap, things that have happened to them, etc. It sounds cliche, but you have no idea what someone is going through in their life when you meet them. I went through this phase in the beginning where I felt bad because my own problems seemed so insignificant to other people's. But I try to remember now that it's all relative. Just because my most horrible experience isn't as bad as your most horrible experience, it doesn't mean my pain's not valid and legit. And on that note, there are clients who leave me thinking, I admire you for your strength. I'm not sure I wouldn't have killed myself in your position. I'm a prison psychologist. The thing that I think has changed the most about me is how much I think of prisoners as everyday people. In the white, suburban town I was raised in, Gangbangers and pedophiles were talked about in the same vein as pirates and knights, sort of mythical people. Now I know tons of gangbangers and pedophiles, and they are real people to me. Also, now when everyday people say things like I hope that rapist on the news gets butt fricked every day in prison, I just feel bad about how little they know about that rapist. He probably was once the victim of sexual abuse too, and now you are wishing more sexual violence on him? I don't. I'm not a psychologist, but I am a QMHPCS, which qualifies me to do a lot of mental health work. I worked a year at a state psych hospital and I'm currently at an outpatient mental health authority. I think one of the biggest things I've learned is that people's actions don't always define who they are. 2 patients at the state hospital stick out particularly. One killed his cousin because he thought she was a demand. Smartest guy I know. Now that he's lucid, he understands what he did and feels regret. He would get coding and computer science textbooks delivered to him on a weekly basis and had a life before he was hospitalized that he may never get back to. The other one that sticks out is a guy that killed his mom and ate her brain. He wrote a book while in the hospital. I remember having weekly conversations with him before I knew what happened. I would have never have guessed that he was capable of such a thing. Now that he's stable and on medication though, he's a completely different person. My main takeaway is that you can't always judge someone for what they've done in the past. You don't know their situation or what's going through their head. That's dark. Everyone lies, all of the time. People are extremely manipulative. People are also subject to very unfortunate situations which make them the way they are. It's an extremely respectful balance. If someone's an butthole to me just out and about in the world, I have a deep understanding for them more so than before. Not like, oh, I'm sorry you're an butthole, must have had a rough upbringing. That's entitled, clearly. But more of, wow, I respect you regardless. So much of your personality isn't even dependent on you as a person. Goes without saying obviously, almost all people can change and take active roles in their life. Everyone has stuff and our family of origin plays an integral role in how we are as adults. It is our experience in the family throughout our development that teaches us how we conduct and manage ourselves. For me, the biggest learning curve was when I began to quiet my inner cynicism, or as I called it, my please voice. I grew up surrounded by mental illness. My mother was a severely struggling paranoid schizophrenic who went on to commit a crime that saw her involuntarily committed for the rest of her life. Through growing up with that and seeing other patients she lived with in the hospital, I learned very young just how devastating mental illness can be. Coupled with a secure knowledge and experiences of abuse, I was well aware that sometimes the world was just crap. I wanted to help people wade through their own personal crap, and so my education pathway was set out before me. When I began working with child offenders fresh out of uni, I was really thrown in the deep end. These children have had some horrendous experiences. It was rare that we had an offender come through who hadn't been abused in some fashion. Many so severely that it had manifested into serious issues that even an adult would struggle to reconcile. This confirmed my knowledge that the world was a crappy place for many people. Then I started to counsel adult non-offenders. People who were seeking therapy of their own accord. The problems were different. Marriage trouble, financial worries, sexuality and identity crises, pressure and stress from various angles. My initial reaction was, as I put it, please don't judge me. I'm being brutally honest here. I internally scoffed that people could find such worry in their almost perfect lives. It didn't take long for me to see that the causal factor matters nowhere near as much as the mental outcome. Many of these people wanted to die. They were that worried over their issue that their mental state was an equal state of disrepair to some of the children I had previously worked with. It was a huge change to my perception that people can struggle with many things, and my own judgment on what is or isn't worthy of struggling over is worth exactly jack crap and was nothing more than self-absorbed and biased perceptions. It changed my whole outlook on helping people and made me a better person. Every bit of lies and one person's heartbreaking story might just be an attempt to manipulate your heartstrings. That aside, I wish we were more sympathetic or empathetic to one another, but there's always the few who takes advantage of a good system and fricks everyone who needs it over. What a small percentage of our society is truly psychologically healthy. Health is more than lack of acute disorder, and most people are stuck at some level of development, or sexual repression, or addiction, etc. One of my main influences, Wilhelm Reich, estimated the proportion of healthy people in the West at about 2%, and it may have gotten worse since the 1940s. So those few people you meet who seem to have their whole lives together, seem to have everything going for them, have good relationships and long-term ambitions, perhaps some of them are the healthy ones. It would be great if they weren't seen as exceptional, but as the new norm to aspire to. Part of the problem is that we as a society confuse these differences with personality quirks, assuming everyone is equally adult just because our ages are equal. You don't magically become a man when you lose your virginity or turn 18, and we don't want to be told this. We want to believe we are fully adult, just like we've always been told we automatically would be. So we try to put together our own image of adulthood that lets us live that fantasy, and we never quite escape the feeling that it isn't working. This is why figures like Michael Cera are so popular. They reflect the many of us who feel like grown-up children, and aren't trying to be satisfied with that. There is good news in this, that there is far more hope than people who identify with Sarah could have ever imagined. A sign of this is when people say, everybody is faking it, there is no adulthood. There is such thing as adulthood, and it's not your fault if you haven't reached it, but it is in your power to do so in the future. This insight is a picture of bittersweet. It means, in a way, there is, as you have felt, something incomplete about you, and also, that you are entitled to become much more. Not a psychologist here, but I volunteered at a mental health institute for several months. I realized that absolutely anyone could end up with severe mental problems. Many people there just had one too many things go wrong in their life, but there were also people with extremely good lives and good mental faculties who experienced head trauma from sports or accidents and now have mental health issues as a result. No one is safe from mental health problems. Be empathetic towards the mentally ill. You or your loved ones might be there someday. One of those threads where I could write a shitload, but then I realize that I am just in the second semester and keep my filthy unvalidated knowledge for myself. Posted man. At least one other person will read it and probably like to talk to you about it. I've learned that college students are vain buttholes when interning for psychology masters. And as a former vain butthole here, the key is to remember that people are all different and that there isn't help for those who don't want it. There aren't really keys or pro tips in this line of work, except being a psychiatrist is much more black and white than psychology, so different people may be better at one or the other and they're similar compared to other jobs but still different. Got a bachelor's and master's of science in psychology and I'll be a board certified behavior analyst, BCBA, in about 3 months. I went with psychology because I never had that fundamental understanding of why anybody liked or disliked what they did, or why people acted so differently. Now I understand the general functions that had to be present to shape various people's personalities, but the mystique is gone and that's good enough for me. I use ABA all day each day. That's not to say that I manipulate people, because I don't. I honestly don't really give a dang about anyone outside of my friends and family, but I shape little behaviors that are beneficial to everyone when the opportunities present themselves. Right now I use precision teaching and a varied form of explicit instruction to teach beginner and intermediate algebra to incoming college freshmen that don't know how to multiply without a calculator. 4 months out from my SID, no matter how innately terrible a person seems, their behavior was learned from somewhere. Even parents who seemingly do the opposite of parent don't do so just because that's what they learned. I can do an intake with a new patient and reflect on how annoying, terrible, mean a person is, but hearing their story and where those behaviors come from, while it doesn't excuse the behaviors, can change my understanding of the person. This is going to sound super cheesy, but so far in my career as a clinical psychologist, going on 8 years now, I still haven't met a patient I haven't liked. Sure, I've had patients with personality traits or habits that were less than likable, but still as I got to know each of them I develop a fondness for some part of them. People are fascinating and lovable, and I'm so privileged I get to know so many people's inner lives. A large number of these comments are stating something similar to a large percentage of our society is not psychologically healthy, or a large percentage are unhappy. I just wanted to point out there is a selection bias with people who either choose or are forced into therapy. I think there will naturally be a higher percentage of mentally unhappy, unhealthy people within that group. Just something to consider. Two things have become more apparent to me since undergrad, graduate school and now a few years of professional experience. First and foremost, people's propensity to fake good and cover up their pain and suffering while at the same time allowing their desires to blind themselves to many of the sources of their suffering. I am also amazed by the insight and resiliency many of my clients have been able to cultivate in the face of everything that's been thrown at them in this world. I work largely with college-aged adults. I went from thinking, I'll be able to figure out all sorts of things about behavior and attitude and I'll have a bunch of reliable answers to the questions I've always asked, to how did this article get published? It's obviously and utterly flawed and therefore invalid. Anyone who reads this and misses the problem will be very misled, because I've learned, more than anything, that people have very selective attention and just plain don't see the whole picture, myself included. One can never read all of the research and synthesize it adequately to fully understand themselves or the people around them. Heck, even within the psychological community there are pretty big knowledge gaps between the different divisions. Sports psychologists and industrial organizational psychologists seem to have developed theories of motivation independently of one another that both reached the same general conclusion. So just imagine all of the time and effort that they might have saved if they had just sat down to talk at some point. That's what I've learned. Psychologists are no more insightful of human experience compared to others by at most a single standard deviation. Not a psychologist, but a social worker. I am 2 years into this job, literally 1 week fresh out of college, and I'm hitting the burnout you always hear about. I think something that people might not recognize is that psychology and social work are a thankless job. My actual title is wraparound facilitator, which is a relatively new approach to mental health. 20 years old, I have always been an open-minded person, but the one thing I've noticed as a recurring thing with the families I have serviced is, and this is strictly speaking about the low-income, Medicaid level people I have worked with, the public perception of mental health is super inaccurate. Most people I work with assume that a child's bad behavior should change instantaneously. Change is an incremental process and can take months or years before you see anything worth noticing. If I had $1 for every time I've heard, he just needs a good butt whooping and he'd act right, I'd be a very rich man. If you are struggling with your child's behavior and they don't have a serious diagnosis, you need to think about how you are parenting. If your kid is an angel at school and a demon at home, then it's probably due to a lack of structure. I've grown a lot more accepting, but I've only got a bachelor's in psych and will not be furthering it due to poor grades. Basically, fetishes don't freak me out or surprise me at all at this point. My focus was on sexuality, and neither do mental illnesses. I do think the weird fetishes online though, and Rule 34, felt so much more interesting after my courses than they did before. Instead of being weirded out by furries or scat fetishists or whatever, I started wondering why the trends were the way they were. So wank on, my frisky strangers, wank on. Made me realize that there is a reason for everything. It made me more forgiving and accepting of people of all mentalities and behavior, etc. That politics have influenced mental health care as much as the hard-working professionals. That being a professional does not work as well as being an empathetic human being. And that child abuse is one of the few things that gets me fantasizing about committing murder. I work in trauma. If you live in a big city, you have ridden public transportation with an individual that has schizophrenia. I'm not saying this to scare you, but to humanize them, because so few people understand the disorder, including those that suffer from it, and stigma results therein. As the child of a psychologist, I've realized that psychologists are freaking nuts. My mom has such a fricked up life and personality, and yet people pay her money to give them advice. I asked her if she was interested in going to a therapist because she of all people understands how helpful they are, and she said no because it would look bad on her. I've worked a lot of different jobs in a lot of divisions with several companies. I've learned that everyone has a lot more going on than you think, and there's always more to a problem than just your perspective on it. A lot of people complain about different departments or workers that aren't on their team. Why can't so and so just do this for me? It should be easy, that sort of thing. When you see their side of things though, you see the nightmare that they're actually dealing with. That little thing you asked for might not be so simple, or it may be an incredibly low priority for them. In my experience, every department complains about every other department and thinks their department is the only one doing things right. So most of the posts here seem to be about abnormal psych, so I thought maybe I'd switch things up with my experience in industrial and organizational psychology, or IO psych. But don't worry, it's depressing too. After college, before continuing on into grad school, I managed to get an internship at a management consulting firm specializing in healthcare. We hired and fired people so companies didn't have to get their hands dirty. As you move up the corporate hierarchy, people love to say we don't play politics here, but they're constantly leveraging their power and manipulating perceptions, which is the very definition of politics. One of my first days, I was asked to keep notes at a CTO's meeting where they were trying to choose add-ons for their payroll software. The CTO spent the whole time discussing privacy screens on monitors. It was bizarre. After the meeting, he cornered me and demanded to see my notes. He was furious. He asked me if I knew he had hired my firm and if my superiors would be happy if they lost the account because of me. We then spent the next hour rewriting my notes in his office with him leaning over my shoulder. The whole experience was surreal. This man had one job: pick software add-ons. And he shirked it completely and proceeded to spend the next few hours harassing directors and the various project managers at the meeting to craft his own perception about what happened at the meeting after the fact. There were non-documented hallway meetings with individuals and emails sent via dictation from underlings. It was like watching a mafia boss use every channel of communication but his own to avoid any responsibility. And this was the way it was at every one of my contracts. It's how the game is played. A CEO might make a handful of major decisions a year. The rest of the time they're spending 10 hours a day maintaining the reality distortion bubble around themselves, delegating, and acquiring favors. We like to believe where we work is a meritocracy and that all of our jobs are logical and performed with the utmost efficiency and productivity. In reality, the only thing that matters is how you are perceived. And a lot of money and effort goes into creating this competent perception around upper level management. I can't wait for the day when you could have Watson being fed with data from experts and advisors who could make the same decisions without all the posturing and pageantry that wastes a majority of the time. And now at 33 I have decided I hate it and I'm going to be a nurse. Most psychologists are pretty crazy themselves and go into the profession to explain their own fricked up minds. Or so it seems. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.